Mr. Wright.
Thank you. Yes. First witness is Dr. Mike Brewer.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming along to help us, Dr. Brewer.
Thank you very much.
Now, Dr. Brewer, there are microphones. They'll amplify your voice, but do try and speak clearly. And we try not to go too quickly so that a full note can be taken of what is said. Dr. Brewer, you are the Chief Economist and Deputy Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And you were instructed by the inquiry to prepare a report on the impact of both labour market interventions and the social security system on inequalities during the pandemic, is that right?
Yes, it is.
And you've got a copy of your report with you, signed and dated September of 2025.
Yes, I do.
And the inquiry reference is INQ 000588132 for that report. The report is focused on inequalities, but to assist you, I'm going to structure my questions this morning on 5 broad topics. All right, so I'll just set those out, and then we'll get into the topics, and I'll ask you some questions. First, I'd like to explore with you some of the key aspects of the UK labour market before the pandemic. So focusing on pre-existing inequalities. That's in order to provide some context in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the labour market and the economic response to it. Second, I want to ask you about, in broad terms, the economic shock and whether that shock had an equal or unequaling impact across the labour market. Third, I'd like to focus with you on labour market interventions. So that is essentially looking at the interventions that were taken, asking you to help us in your opinion as to their success relative to the policy objectives, what worked well, what didn't, what might be done better in the future. Fourth, to perform the same exercise looking at the social security system, if we can. So establishing the system going into the pandemic, looking at the changes that were made, and performing that same process of looking at success relative to policy objectives. Mm-hmm. And then fifth and finally, I want to ask you some questions about long COVID, and the extent to which long COVID was factored into adjustments made to those systems, and to ask you some forward-looking questions about that. So can we start with pre-existing inequalities in the labour market? And first of all, can I ask you to help us to understand what we mean by that term, inequality in the labour market? Should we understand you can look at that in 2 principal ways? Firstly, inequality in terms of pay and earnings.
Yes, that's right. I think when you're considering the labour market, there are a number of different dimensions you should think about, a number of different domains. One of them is definitely pay and earnings. And I think that is what most people think about when they consider inequalities in the labour market. But I also think that when we consider the pandemic in particular and the impact that had, it is also important to think about people's contractual nature of their work, which affects their rights, their powers as employees. And I think that turned out to be also very important. Inequalities in that dimension also turned out to be very important.
Okay. So there's the way in which most people think about inequality: who gets paid more, who gets paid less. But also, it's the basis on which people are employed, how they're employed, and the rights that they acquire or don't acquire as a result of the way in which they are employed.
Yes, absolutely.
And do those two things tend to sit separately, or are they interrelated? So in other words, people who tend to be less well paid may find that they have less rights in the labour market.
They do tend to sort of fit together, unfortunately. Perhaps due to the fact that some people just have less power in the labour market and the workplace, so they command a lower wage, and they also find it harder to secure the kind of permanent and more secure kind of employment contracts. So they do tend to go together, and that's particularly notable, for example, when we look at certain sectors of the economy. The hospitality sector of the economy, for example, has some of the lowest paid jobs, but it also has the highest incidence of 0 hours contracts, which is one of those types of insecure employment.
Thank you. And is it right that you are able to look at statistics and data and track, as it were, inequality across different cohorts? So one would be to look at the difference between the richest and the poorest, but you can also look at inequality by looking at, for example, protected characteristics, age, gender, disability, and see how inequality sits in amongst those cohorts of people.
Yes, that's right. It's definitely important to think about inequalities between different groups, and typically we would do that using the protected characteristics from the Equality Act. Shall I run through some of those key differences?
Yes, if you could.
Yes. So there are differences between men and women. Men tend to work more and earn more than women. Now, actually, it turns out that wasn't particularly important for the pandemic, so I didn't focus much on that in my evidence. For ethnicity, there are very clear differences between certain ethnic groups. These are not all bad compared to the white majority population. Some ethnic minorities do tend to earn more than the white majority, but there are others, particularly Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and some of the African ethnic groups, who will tend to earn less than the white majority. There's an important intersection between gender and ethnicity. So some of the worst paid groups in society will be minority ethnic women, for example, where there's a particularly large pay penalty compared to the white majority. We can think about age. Younger people tend to earn less than older people. Some of that is natural progression in the labour market. But it's also true that young people also do tend to be more likely to be on those more insecure labour market contracts, which turned out to be a problem when the pandemic hit. And then finally, there is a disability employment gap and pay gap. So when we think about disability, this has a particularly large employment gap between those who are disabled and those who are not, which you might expect. But even when you look among those who are working, there is a pay gap between those who are disabled and those who are not.
Thank you. And can you also, I think you've touched on this, but can you also look at inequality across sectors of the labour market? So before the pandemic, there were some sectors in which pre-pandemic pay was lower, conditions tended to be more insecure, there was greater inequality.
Yes, absolutely. So before the pandemic hit, the sector with the lowest median pay was accommodation and food services, or hospitality, as we might call it. You know, the highest hourly pay is found in the finance and insurance services, so professional jobs. Some sectors with below average hourly pay, I say hospitality, wholesale and retail, arts, entertainment and recreation, and then personal services, particularly those including hair and beauty, childcare, cleaning, textiles, and social care. And I've already read out some of the sectors which will go on to be affected by the pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
And I think what's particularly noteworthy is that some of these lower paid sectors also have large proportions of workers who are on insecure employment contracts. So I said the lowest paid sector is hospitality, which across all sectors, that has the highest proportion of 0-hour contract workers, at about just under a quarter of workers in that sector pre-pandemic were on a 0 hours contract.
Right. And taking a very high-level view, pre-pandemic, generally, did the United Kingdom have the highest levels of earning inequality in the developed world by measured statistics?
Yes, so we tend to look across OECD countries, which are about 30 of the most developed countries, most comparable countries to the UK. And pre-pandemic, across OECD countries, the UK was nearly top of the league table when it comes to earnings inequality. So that's the gap between the low-paid and the high-paid. I should note, though, that thanks to the UK's relatively high minimum wage, that inequality is sort of more marked at the top end, so between the very well-paid and the medium-paid, than it is at the bottom end, so between the low-paid and the medium-paid. So one of the good features of the UK economy when it comes to inequality is we have a relatively high minimum wage, which provides some protection to the lowest paid.
So the gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid is significant, but the gap between the lowest paid and those in the middle is less because of the minimum wage, or in part because of the minimum wage.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And also, is it right, taking a high-level view, that generally part-time workers tend to have a lower median pay, hourly pay, than full-time workers? So if you're in part-time employment, your rate of pay is likely to be lower.
Yes, that's definitely right. We talk about something called a part-time pay penalty. So not only are you working fewer hours, but part-time jobs tend to be paid less per hour. Part of that is to do with the kind of sectors and jobs that where part-time work happens, but not all of it. So even if we zoom in on the same occupation, the same sectors, the same kind of workers, there does tend to be a penalty to working part-time. Probably linked to the fact that there are some workers who are very keen to have that extra flexibility in their workplace, and they find it then harder to get into the highest paid jobs.
Okay. Now, you've touched on the fact that pay is but one factor. In terms of employment conditions, just so we understand pre-pandemic,
yeah.
I think this is paragraph 11 of your report at page 6, that at the start of 2019, you say that 63% of the workforce were in standard employment arrangements. That's working as full-time employees. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So in a full-time permanent job, applying to just under 2/3 of the workforce, meaning that about 1/3 of the workforce are either self-employed, or they're working part-time, or they have a temporary contract, or they're in some of the most insecure kinds of work, such as 0 hours contracts or agency work.
Thank you. And this is paragraph 15 at page 7 of your report. At the start of the pandemic, there were about 2.4 million people in self-employed, 0 hours, insecure work arrangements. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So this is sort of zooming in on those people who are in the most sort of insecure, the most precarious kind of work. Obviously, if you are self-employed and low earning, then you have very few employment rights, and some of these people will be amongst the most precariously in the workforce. And then 2.4 million people who are employees, but they do not have secure working arrangements. That might be because it's a casual, seasonal, or temporary job, or it might be because they're doing agency work or 0 hours contracts where they're not actually promised, they have no guarantee to work.
And so pre-pandemic, we have a position where there are certain sectors of the economy where people tend to earn less and tend to be in more vulnerable types of employment, that is not secure employment. Is that
That's absolutely right, yes. And as we said, those two things tend to go together.
Right. So let's move on to the second topic then, which is the shock on the labour market in terms of inequality, and taking that as the starting point of people in certain sectors that receive lower pay and have less secure employment. You've highlighted some of those sectors, hospitality being one example you've given. And the pandemic, we know, resulted in social restrictions. And did those restrictions impact those sectors?
Yeah, so the impact of the pandemic on the economy and the labour market was very, very unequal by sector. It varied enormously by sector. And that reflected various factors. Part of it was due to what counted as essential work during the initial lockdown. Some sectors were effectively told to stop operating altogether. Some of that, it reflects which sectors found it easier to move to remote working than others. And some of it just reflects that with a contagious virus operating, people as consumers naturally wanted to do less of some activities than others. So this is not a comment on lockdown as such. This is also a comment about this is what happens when a contagious virus hits. People naturally will change their behaviour to avoid certain activities. So it is very, very unequal in terms of the sectors that are affected. Now, depending whether we look at data on GDP or employment, we might get a slightly different set of sectors being the worst affected, but it's essentially hospitality, so accommodation and food services, it's arts, entertainment and recreation, and some of the other personal services such as hair and beauty. On the other extreme, health and social work sector saw its employment and its share of economic activity grow in the pandemic. And there have been other sectors like information technology where they were able to rapidly make the adjustment to home working and were essentially unaffected by the pandemic.
And you summarise this in paragraph 5 at page 5, and I'll just ask if that can be put up on the screen. You say there that the economic shock was felt very unevenly across different sectors, and so was the impact on the labour market. And you list those sectors and point out that these are sectors that disproportionately employ young and low-paid workers. And this is in the main, but not the only reason why the impact of the pandemic was so unequal.
Yes, that's right. So hospitality, non-food retail and leisure are all depend a great deal on face-to-face contact, and that's the reason why they were heavily affected by the economic shock of the pandemic. And then it just so happens that those are also sectors that tend to have below average pay. And it just so happens those are also sectors which might have more use of insecure employment contracts and where you might disproportionately find young people or ethnic minority workers.
Is there an amplification effect that should be taken into account here? By which I mean, if you look at pre-existing inequality in different sectors, and then look at the nature of the shock by sector, so it tends to be hitting those sectors where there's pre-existing inequality, you therefore have an amplification of the effect on inequality of the pandemic.
I mean, in the absence of any government intervention, if we'd just gone into lockdown, let the pandemic hit the labour market, we would definitely have seen a worsening of inequalities, both between high-paid and low-paid workers, and between the different kind of groups with different protected characteristics, as we've also said. The sectors that were most heavily affected tended to employ low-paid workers and had disproportionately large numbers of ethnic minority and younger workers. And so, yes, inequalities in general would have increased when the pandemic hit.
Thank you. Can we turn then to topic 3, the labour market interventions, so those things that the government did in the labour market, looking at their effect on inequalities, and you've just touched at a very high level on that. First of all, this pandemic, so its effect on the economy or its effect on the labour market was different to an ordinary economic downturn. Is that right?
Well, the nature of the shock was different from the usual, the usual economic shock in the sense it was very rapid and very concentrated in certain sectors. Then we had some very unusual interventions with the coronavirus job retention scheme and the self-employment scheme. And as a result of those two things, the sort of the story that the data tells us about how the pandemic affected the labour market is also very unusual. So in particular, there was only a very small rise in unemployment during the pandemic, which is very unusual for a labour market shock. And instead, if you want to see the impact of the pandemic in the labour market, you have to look at measures like the number of hours worked across the economy or the level of economic activity across the economy. It was also unusual in that we bounced back very quickly at the end into relative normality by the end of 2021, and a more typical economic shock would have a longer, you'd see the impact for longer afterwards. So I'm thinking about the financial crisis or the recessions of the 1990s there.
Okay, thank you. And when we talk about labour market interventions, the principal interventions that you've considered, the job retention scheme, coronavirus job retention scheme, the self-employed income support scheme, Kickstart and Restart. They're the principal labour market interventions that you've considered. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you deal with, at paragraph 28 of your report, page 14, the objectives, the direct aims of the labour market interventions. So we've just put that up on the screen. They were numerous. First, we see there to prevent job losses as a principal objective. Is that right?
Yes, and in fact, that paragraph 28.1, I think, has probably conflated two objectives. But the most important one was to prevent job losses. So the government did not want employers to have to lay off their staff for what it thought might only be a temporary economic shock. So that is the most important objective behind the job retention scheme. But what that paragraph also says is that the schemes are also trying to prevent households from seeing a large negative shock to their income when they're put out of work. I've put those in the same paragraph, but I think they're probably two slightly different objectives.
Yeah.
Actually, can I sorry to interrupt, that's right. In fact, that paragraph talks about the self-employment business dry up. In other words, it seems to be focused on protecting households, the self-employed households.
Yes, I may have blurred the two together in that paragraph. So the job retention scheme was aiming to prevent job losses and also to protect the incomes of those people who would otherwise have seen job losses. For the self-employment scheme, it's not about preventing job losses. It's just about protecting the income of those self-employed people whose businesses dried up.
So we should separate that out. For those who were employed, objective number one is to retain those jobs.
Yeah.
For those who are employed or self-employed, second objective is to protect household income.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay. And if we could go back to the paragraph, please. We also see at 28.2, second objective to protect employers from having to pay staff who couldn't actually do anything productive in the business.
Yeah, so the government would have been worried that had it not introduced the job retention scheme, that heavily affected employers would have had the choice, would either have laid off their workers or would be eating into their profits by kind of retaining workers who were not doing any useful work. And it was trying to prevent any of that from happening. I'm feeling the urge to go on to talk about scarring, but I'm not sure if this is the right time, Council.
What would be the effect of that on scarring? If you say if that obviously occurs to you that this is an appropriate point to deal with that.
So the job retention scheme has said it was trying to prevent employers from having to let their staff go. Because that is very disruptive to a business. So even if the pandemic had been a short, sharp shock, the Treasury, the government, would have wanted to prevent employers from having to let their staff go, because that process of finding good staff takes time and money and effort, and even a short, and that is. The Treasury was worried that process would have permanently harmed businesses.
And is that not just finding good staff, but also matching skilled workers to skilled jobs. So it's about matching their skills to the role.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there will be some jobs for whom there is a large pool of workers who could probably do that vacancy, and there'll be other jobs where it's harder to find the right match. And the Treasury was concerned that if we had made millions of businesses let their workers go, then it would have taken a lot of time, a lot of money to build them up again, and some of those matches might not have been as perfect as they were before the pandemic, and that would have had a permanent impact on the business's profitability and the size of the economy.
Okay.
So just preventing those job losses from the point of view of the employer was an important objective.
If we just go back to the objectives, 28.3. You've made this point in passing, but another core objective was to enable employers to get back to business as soon as conditions allowed.
Exactly, yes. So the idea would be that if an employer can just put you on furlough, use the job retention scheme, the hope was that when the pandemic stopped, that person could immediately come back to work and start to be useful and productive again. If they hadn't had the job retention scheme and you'd had to hire all your workers from scratch, that would have slowed down the speed at which the economy returned to normal.
And then a final objective, really, that Kickstart and Restart were aimed at, 28.4, was for those who found themselves out of work, these were schemes designed to prevent them being unemployed for long periods of time, to get them back into the labour market.
Yes, that's right. So these are two schemes run by the Department of Work and Pensions, which were aimed at younger workers and older workers, respectively. Younger adults and older adults, respectively. And it was trying to prevent those people from suffering long spells of unemployment. And that is because we know that individuals who experience long spells of unemployment can find themselves permanently disadvantaged in the labour market. And that's particularly worrying for young workers.
And I think you also observe that it might also be said there was a broader macroeconomic aim, which was essentially to reassure business and households that the government was willing to act and could act quickly to increase confidence and prop up confidence in the economy in general.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the modern economy depends enormously on households and businesses' confidence, and uncertainty it can be a very dangerous thing. If people are uncertain or worried about the future, then they stop spending if they're a household, they stop investing if they're a business, and that can become a vicious circle. So a very important thing the government did in its March 2020 budget and in its subsequent activities was to try and reassure people, businesses, employers that it would, well, indeed, that's what the Chancellor then said, it would do what it took, it will do what it takes to support the economy. And that is to try and keep confidence up and try and prevent the economy from getting into a vicious circle where everybody is hunkering down, no one's making long-term decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. And so you, in your report, accept that there was an absolute need for urgent intervention at the start of the pandemic to implement policies to support the labour market. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Yeah. And so we've touched on what those interventions were. Can we move on within this topic into your view, first of all, about the job retention scheme, as to whether it was well designed from the point of view, in particular, of addressing inequalities? And I think your overall conclusion is yes, it saved jobs as a fundamental. Is that right?
Yes, so we should, of course, recognise that the job retention scheme was designed extremely quickly, which is of great credit to the government. But yes, my assessment was that it was very successful in preventing widespread job loss, and it was fairly well designed from the point of view of inequalities. It was a scheme that came into effect very quickly. It was fairly easy for employers to access, and those are all sort of good things from the point of view of inequalities. The government put a cap on how much of people's salaries it was reimbursing to try and prevent it from subsidising the earnings too much of those who might not need it. So that's also a good thing from the point of view of inequalities. If people, the government departments undertook evaluations that try to look at whether it's successful in preventing job loss. And their bottom line was that the job retention scheme saved about 4 million jobs. So there are about 11 million people who were on the job retention scheme at some point in the pandemic. And those estimates imply that had it not existed, about 4 million of those would have become unemployed. Now, that doesn't mean they'd have been unemployed throughout the whole pandemic. They might have moved on to other work at some point. But an increase in unemployment of 4 million would have been catastrophic for the labour market.
And I think you also come to the broad conclusion that had the government not brought in the job retention scheme, much of the impact would have fallen on less advantaged workers. So inequality would have been exacerbated. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and we touched on that already, and that is mostly due to the unequal nature of the shock hitting certain sectors by more than others, and those sectors employing low-paid people or people from ethnic minorities or younger workers.
You have identified some ways in which the scheme could have been better designed or refined, in your view. Is that right?
Yes, I have. Yes, I think there are two areas. One is about the guidance provided to employers on which staff they could and could not furlough, and the other one is about whether employees had a right to be put on a job retention scheme. So I'll tackle those in turn. On the first of those, so guidance given to employers on who they could and couldn't furlough. There was some uncertainty, at least initially at the beginning, about whether furlough could be used for parents who were not able to work because of their caring responsibilities. And of course, that's particularly relevant when schools were only accepting children of key workers. And we know that impacted many mothers disproportionately. And the second area where the guidance to employers, I think, could have been improved relates to employees who were sick or self-isolating. And I know, obviously, Module 6 covered self-isolation support, but I identified in my report that essentially employers were not supposed to use the job retention scheme to furlough employees who were sick or self-isolating, which to me seems like a missed opportunity. And then I also identify some flaws in the sense that employees didn't have a right to go on furlough. So the job retention scheme was a program made available to employers, and employers chose which of their staff they put on the job retention scheme and which they didn't.
If I could just come in there, because no, this may chime with the point you're making. If we could have, please, from the Every Story Matters records, this is INQ 000588-209, page 68 of the record. We see there at the top with the dark blue quotation marks, the furlough payment which I was entitled to was only payable if the employer applied for it. If the worker was entitled to it, I was, but the employer didn't want to apply. There was absolutely nothing that could have been done for me, and that may chime with the point I think you're making. Is that
yes?
Is that right?
That's a very powerful story there. Yes, so employers chose themselves who to put on furlough and who not to put on furlough. And so, let's take an example of an employer whose business has been totally shut down or can't operate during the first pandemic. If they were employing their staff on casual or insecure contracts, if it was a 0 hours contract or a temporary work, they could just take the option of either giving that person no work, giving them 0 hours work, or making them redundant. Even though they could have put that worker on furlough and have their wages totally covered by the government. So the employer might not, To the employer, that makes minimal difference, but to the employee, that makes a massive difference, whether you're made redundant or whether you're put on the furlough scheme. And so, yeah, the quote you've put up there looks like it's from somebody who was not able to take advantage of furlough and instead, lost their work and might have lost their job. But there's another quote on the same page from somebody who would have liked to have been put on furlough, but was instead made to carry on working, and then ended up doing more work. And so it worked. Yeah. So yeah, there are several aspects to this point I was highlighting, that employees didn't have any say into whether or not they were put onto the job retention scheme.
Now, if that sounded like a good idea to have a right to furlough, can you just help us to think about what it might look like? If you thought, well, it sounds in principle like a good idea, but how would it actually, in your view, operate? How could it operate?
Yeah, and I'm aware that what I'm going to set out may not have been realistic in April 2020, but I think it might be realistic in future for a future furlough scheme, perhaps in less urgent times. But what I've suggested in my report is that employees might have the right to go on furlough, just as employees now have the right to apply for flexible working. So the right to flexible work does not mean that you will definitely get flexible work, but it means that you are allowed to make a formal request to your employer to go on to have a flexible work contract, and your employer must consider that properly, and there are only a certain number of ways your employer can turn it down, and if they don't do it properly, you can appeal to an outside body. So I was suggesting a similar sort of right for future furlough or job retention schemes, that an employee should be able to make a formal request to go on them, and that request would be denied only in a certain set of circumstances. So that's one way which I'm imagining an employee might have a right to be put on furlough.
So when you talk about a right to furlough, you're not suggesting there should be a veto given to the employee either way as to, one, whether they are or are not made to keep on working, or two, as to whether they are or are not made redundant rather than being furloughed. You're suggesting that there could be a formal mechanism by which an employee has a right to request it.
Yes, I think what I've suggested is a light touch right. One could imagine sort of being more favourable to the employee, but you could imagine. I mean, the government did all sorts of things during the pandemic, didn't they? Passing all sorts of laws. One never imagined they would. But yeah, I mean, a more extreme version would be preventing employers from making their staff redundant, and instead requiring them to use the job retention scheme. But a sort of more modest proposal, which is still giving employers flexibility, would be to give employees the right to request. Employers can turn it down, but they would have to have a valid reason for doing so.
Yeah. And in terms of other recommendations, I'm going to take these briefly because they're in your report, and I've got other ground we need to cover in the time. But you suggest going forwards an off-the-shelf job retention scheme, so one that can be stood up very quickly in any future emergency. Is that right?
Yes, some of the European countries have these kind of schemes in permanent operation. We didn't have one, and the Treasury designed one very quickly, but it is very likely that in future economic shocks or future health shocks we'll need this again. And so the Treasury must learn from the scheme that we had in place during the pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry to interfere with your timing, Mr. Wright.
Not at all.
Going back to the point you made about furlough not applying to those who were self-isolating,
yes.
Was the concern there that people might just say, oh, I've been in contact with someone, so I'm going to self-isolate, so give me furlough? What was the concern?
I'm afraid I don't know, and I can't think of anything I've seen written down that explains that one. It was a very puzzling exception. I remember during the pandemic writing about the support given to self-isolation or employees who were sick, and we honestly couldn't work out why the Treasury had not done this.
But how would you guard against fraud? Or illegitimate claims?
I mean, there were payments. Pushing my knowledge a bit. For somebody who was sick, you could rely on a doctor's certificate. For somebody who was self-isolating, I suppose you'd have to rely on the app pinging, wouldn't you? But there was a scheme, the self-isolation support payment, which was given to low-paid workers who were self-isolating. I suspect you remember the details more than I do, but I can't remember exactly how that verified. But presumably you could borrow from that scheme.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. But you haven't seen anything that set out clearly the rationale for not including self-isolation.
That's right. I haven't seen anything from the Treasury or HMRC that explains that rationale.
But you also made the point about those with caring responsibilities, and in contrast, is this right, that that guidance was clarified quite quickly to make it clear that those with caring responsibilities could be?
Yes, it was clarified by April 2020.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Can we move on to the self-employed income support scheme then?
Yeah.
And first of all, you identify that in the early grants of the scheme, there were arguable deficiencies in that the newly self-employed were not eligible. Is that right?
That's right. There were three big exemptions, or three classes of people who are not eligible for the SACE grant. One was the newly self-employed. Another one was people who had more than £50,000 a year of self-employment income. And the third one were people who got less than half of their income from self-employment.
Yeah. And so that meant that there were certain cliff edges in that scheme. And if you went over a cliff edge, there was no support. Is that
absolutely? It went from full support to nothing. So if you had £50,005 of income in self-employment, you got nothing. If you had £49,995, you were eligible for the grant.
Looking on the other side, you also make the point in your report that there was a minimal need to verify that people had actually been adversely affected by the pandemic in order to claim under the scheme. Is that right?
That is right, yes. Now, this changed slightly through the life of the pandemic, but not by very much. And certainly in the first three grants, all that was required was that claimants certified that they had suffered some downturn in their business.
Yeah. And so you make the point, inequalities work both ways. It might have meant that some people were overcompensated by the scheme relative to whether they'd actually lost money.
Yes, that is definitely the case, that happens sometimes.
And I think you recommend, therefore, in your report that the improvements that were made over the life of the grants should be in place from the start in a future emergency. Is that right? To soften those cliff edges and to increase checks and verification?
Yes, I mean, the HMRC had great difficulty designing this scheme, I think this is clear in their own evidence, because they don't know the income or profits of the self-employed in anything like real time. Now, that may improve in the future because of the way that HMRC is collecting data, but that was the fundamental problem they had. What was surprising, though, was that they didn't introduce a system of clawback. So they could have said, well, we'll pay you this grant now, but when we finally know your income from 2020, we'll look at your income, we'll see whether it actually fell compared to previous years, and if necessary, we'll take back some of your SACE grant. So there are two things it could have done. One would have relied on actually knowing in real time how self-employed people were doing, which was difficult. The other one was a mechanism for clawback, which it could have introduced but didn't. It would be great if either of those were available for future schemes.
Yeah, thank you. And you gave the job retention, you evaluated the job retention scheme, and you said, yes, it did prevent greater inequality. What was your overall conclusion about the self-employed scheme in terms of the impact on inequalities?
Yeah. Well, we've touched on the sort of cliff edges in the self-employment scheme, and some of those definitely led to rough justice. There are some powerful stories told by people who fell the wrong side of that £50,000 line, or who got slightly less than their income, slightly less than half their income came from self-employment, and so got nothing. So there's definitely rough justice there, which is not ideal in public policy. But probably the most problematic gap was in the fact that the newly self-employed weren't eligible at all. So you had to have filed a tax return in the 2018-19 2018-19 tax year, in order to be eligible. So if you'd started in the most recent 12 months before the pandemic hit, you were eligible for nothing. And that would disproportionately affect younger people who were kind of newly starting out in self-employment, or people with more volatile, employment histories who are moving between jobs. So that was a big flaw when it came to, from the point of view of inequalities.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on then to social security interventions, and principally the £20 a week uplift to universal credit and working tax credit? And depending on what the objective of the government was, and I'm going to ask you about two potential different objectives that may have been at play. One objective that we'll see in some of the evidence that's been suggested was that the schemes were designed to help those who are newly unemployed or had suffered a loss of income. So this was about pandemic support for those who lost their job as a result of the pandemic or lost income, and the £20 a week was designed to cushion that. If that was the objective of the scheme, how would you evaluate its success in meeting that objective?
Yes, so it may well have been the case that DWP or the Treasury were concerned that not everybody would have been on the job retention scheme, not everybody could have got the SACE grant. There would have been some people who don't get either, and for them the only form of income protection came through the benefit system. And so the £20 a week would have helped cushion the income blow that such people experienced. I think what I would say is that the degree of income protection provided by the benefit system, even after that £20 a week increase, was on average still much, much less than that provided by the job retention scheme or by the SACE scheme. So absolutely better than nothing, but there was still a very big difference between the experience of people who were furloughed and those who were reliant on universal credit.
So if we put that together with your earlier observations on furlough, then not your choice as an employee as to whether your employer furloughs you or makes you redundant. If they choose to furlough you, you get the relatively generous support of the furlough scheme, 80% of your income. But if your employer chooses to make you redundant, then you are compelled to claim universal credit, and it's £20 a week uplift.
Yes, that's right. And so the basic rate of universal credit when the pandemic hit was £75 a week for a single person. That went up to £95 a week after the extra £25. So that's what you got as a single person if you were made redundant and had to claim benefits. The alternative on the job retention scheme was 80% of your previous salary. So for some people, there'll be a massive difference between those two sums.
Yeah. And would the same general point be made about the self-employed scheme? If you were eligible for the scheme, you got the support that it offered. In contrast, if you missed it, for example, because you earned £50,001, then there was a significant difference.
Yes, that's right. And again, perhaps those of most concern would be the newly self-employed who are not eligible for any support. So yes, exactly. For them, they might be able to claim universal credit, and they would have got £95 a week.
If the objective, however, had been to help everybody who'd experienced increased living costs or was at greater risk of falling into poverty during the pandemic, how do you evaluate that the scheme met those objectives?
Yep. And so if that's, we should also recognise that as well as the £20 a week uplift to universal credit, the government also increased rates of local housing allowance to provide more support to those who were renting. But they also increased rates of tax credits, which went to some working families. But they did not increase all social security benefits. The reason that was given at the time was that this is where I want to introduce the distinction between legacy benefits and universal credit benefits. So in 2020, the government was in the middle of a very large-scale benefit reform where it was phasing out some benefits and phasing in universal credit, but that process had not completed. And so there were still 1 million or so people receiving one of the old legacy benefits, and about 2 million families receiving the old tax credits. And so the government said that it wasn't able to increase the rates of these legacy benefits as quickly as it was changed the rates of universal credit. I'm sorry, I'm not implying they were lying. I'm sure that is correct. Universal credit was built from, on a modern IT system, and the government was able to change those rates very quickly. The legacy benefits were running on decades-old IT systems, and it just wasn't possible to increase the rates of those benefits quickly. So they were not increased initially in April 2020. And I think that was worrying because in those benefits that were not increased included carers allowance, which is a benefit goes to people who cannot work because they're caring for others, and it would have included some people on the old employment and support allowance, which goes to people who are unable to work because of their health and disability. So from the point of view of inequalities, it was worrying that the benefit increase didn't go to some of those groups. And I also think that although the initial decision in March 2020 was justified, it was surprising that the universal credit uplift went on for 18 months. And throughout that 18 months, the government didn't make any attempt to do anything for people on the legacy benefits.
So even if operationally it was challenging or impossible at the outset, it went on for 18 months and nothing was done for those who were not on universal credit?
Exactly, yes.
Right, okay. Can I pick up another point about the benefit cap?
Yeah.
The benefit cap was kept in place during the pandemic, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And the rationale for the benefit cap is it's designed to encourage people into work. That's the objective that underlies it.
Yes, that's right. It applies to you if you are not in work and do not have any disabilities.
Yeah. Can you think of any justification for keeping the cap in place during the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, I've read the evidence provided by Neil Cooling, and the story he tells is that if the intention was to support those who'd newly fallen out of work, then it was okay to leave the benefit cap in place. There is a temporary, if you have newly lost your job, you are exempt from the benefit cap. And so the argument would be that if those are the people we are trying to help, those who've newly lost their job, then they won't actually be affected by the benefit cap.
Just pausing
yes,
there.
Of course.
That exemption is for 9 months, isn't it?
Right. Yes, that's right. Yes.
And of course, this extension went on for 18 months.
Yes.
And so if people hadn't found a job in that time, they might not immediately be caught by the benefit cap, but they could become caught by it.
Yes, that's right. And this feels like another one of those decisions that might have been sensible in March 2020 when we hoped the shock would be over in a few months, but becomes less justifiable as the pandemic goes on. So if the intention was to provide support to people who've lost their job, then perhaps it was okay to leave the benefit cap in place. But if your objective was to provide extra support to low-income families because the pandemic made life more expensive, then I would have wanted to see the benefit cap reformed, changed, increased.
Okay, thank you. And so overall, then, in terms of recommendations, looking at social security payments, is at the heart of your report really the point you make about the difference between what you could have got if you were eligible for furlough or self-employed support as compared to the level of payment if you were in receipt of benefits?
It's absolutely. There was just such a marked difference between the income protection of those who were furloughed or on the SACE scheme and the income protection provided to those who missed out on both and had to claim benefits.
And you describe it in your report as seeming unfair and hard to rationalise. What, in your view, are steps that could be taken to make it less unfair and to align the support across those sorts of schemes?
I mean, that comment was made in light of the relative generosity of the two schemes, and the fact that there were some sort of harsh cliff edges in the job retention scheme and the SACE scheme. Now, if the job retention scheme and the SACE scheme had been less generous, then I might not have made this point quite as much. I think 80% was a fairly generous amount chosen by the government to support people's wages. They could have, in a report we wrote in March 2020, we suggested 2/3 of previous earnings might have been appropriate. There's no science behind this. That's a policy choice. But so one way would have been to make the job retention scheme and SACE schemes less generous, and of course the other way would have been to make the support provided to the newly unemployed more generous. But then we do hit upon the DWP's objective, which is that they felt they didn't have a way to identify those people who'd become newly unemployed. And it may have been that had they been able to do that, they might have felt they would provide more than £20 a week. But because they had to provide the uplift to everybody on universal credit, they limited it to just £20 a week.
So does that, to you, identify a gap in their data, their ability to see whether a person is newly unemployed and to target support?
Yes, so the way universal credit works at the moment, it doesn't really distinguish between whether you're newly out of work or whether you've been out of work for a long time. I think the government were worried about, their priority in March and April 2020 was to get something rolled out as quickly as possible, and therefore it had to be as simple as possible.
In terms of targeting, I mean, what additional data do you conceive that DWP would need in order to better target support to those who needed it?
Well, I suppose, if I think about it, I'm sure DWP probably do know who has become recently unemployed, given all the data they are collecting about their claimants. So perhaps it's an issue about the computers, the IT system that calculates your entitlement to universal credit wasn't set up to make use of that information. So I think it's that bit's not a data collection issue. That is an
evaluation point that there wasn't the ability to monitor it as it was.
Oh, I see. Yes, in my report I touched on other data deficiencies, and one of them relates to monitoring and evaluation. I and others at Resolution Foundation were very struck during the pandemic that it seemed that the Treasury and the ONS had very few real-time sources of data on people's financial circumstances, of the financial health of households in general, and it seemed that quite a lot of that information was being generated by outside organisations commissioning their own surveys. So I do think that the pandemic showed a lack of real-time data on the financial circumstances of houses, which would help monitoring, which is different from the operation of policy.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Can I move on then to the fifth and final topic, which is some questions about long COVID?
Yeah.
And I want to ask you, first of all, about whether or not you consider that there's a case for specific support for those who were suffering from long COVID. And you deal with that in your report at page 56. It's paragraph 131(2), if I could have that up, please.
Yeah. I carefully read the evidence submitted by the long COVID groups, and some of the stories told there are terrible. My view is that the UK's social security system is not very generous to people who have fluctuating health conditions. So we have a rather binary social security system where you're either ill or not ill. And so if your condition fluctuates, then you might fall between two stools. And the second point is that our system is not very generous to people who have a health condition. So that's both in the rates of statutory sick pay and also in the rates of benefit paid through either universal credit or employment support allowance. So my view is that the pandemic and the experience of long COVID sufferers really brought those flaws, to people's attention, and it meant that many more people were experiencing this themselves for the first time, and perhaps people who never thought they'd have to rely on the social security system. But I can't see why a system specifically for people suffering from long COVID was justified compared to other conditions which are fluctuating and long term.
Yeah. So, thank you. Can I turn then finally to one discrete area regarding long COVID, and that is to ask you about the potential for long COVID to have a long-term effect on the economy. Now, long COVID sufferers may become economically inactive if they stop working altogether, losing their jobs or going on permanent sick leave. And if somebody became economically inactive, you would consider that ordinarily, wouldn't you, as an economic cost of the condition?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. But do you agree that in addition there is a need to consider those who remain active in the labour market but who have become less productive as a result of their health condition, long COVID in particular?
Well, that will be another way in which the pandemic or long COVID is having a permanent effect on the size of the economy, yes.
Because a decline in productivity is an economic cost, is that right?
I wouldn't call that a decline in productivity, but it would be a decline in economic output. Yes, if people are working fewer hours, they're producing less, the economy is smaller.
And that is a form of economic scarring from the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you consider that form of scarring from everything you've seen was sufficiently taken into account in decision making? If you're unable to comment.
I don't think that was relevant for the job retention scheme or the universal credit uplift, and so I don't think I can comment.
Right. Thank you very much. Those are my questions. I think there are some.
There are. Mr. Jacobs. Oh, Miss Peacock. Are you? Oh, it is Miss Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs over there.
Thank you. Yeah.
Dr. Brewer, just a couple of questions, if I may, on behalf of the Trades Union Congress.
Yep.
Those in the creative industries very commonly work in short-term PAYE roles or a combination of short-term PAYE and self-employed contracts.
Yep.
They often fill in the gaps between the CJRS and the SEISS, whether because they missed the cut-off dates for CJRS or self-employed but less than half of their total income, or they were newly self-employed. They had the sort of rough justice that you've spoken about in your evidence. How, in your view, in a scheme in the next pandemic, could those gaps be narrowed?
Thank you. Yes. What I haven't touched on so far is that the CJRS was an economy-wide scheme. So at no point did the government try and limit it to certain sectors, even though, as the pandemic went on, there was overwhelming evidence that the effect was concentrated in certain sectors. And so that suggests, that one route that could be available is that if it were limited to certain sectors, the design could take into account features of those sectors, in more detail. I've also touched on the fact that in future it may be that HMRC has better real-time information on the incomes and profits of the self-employed people because of its Making Tax Digital program, which should mean that it has information every quarter on people's self-employed profits, and that might allow a scheme like the SACE to help the newly self-employed in a way that just wasn't possible in 2020. But I think there'll be another class of people you're talking about who were employees but on insecure contracts. I mean, for them, my suggestion that people have a right to furlough might be of help to such people if there were such schemes in the future.
On the sort of first limb of your response, the sector-specific approach, there seems in some respects to be a trade-off in these schemes between fraud risk and rough justice, and sometimes if you avoid rough justice, you have greater fraud risk. Might it be that a sector-specific approach enables that balance to be struck in a more effective, slightly less crude way?
Yeah, I think for the point of view of the job retention scheme, the government went big and wide, because I think its primary objective was not try and reduce the number of people falling through the gaps. Had it gone for sector specific, it would have introduced new cliff edges, and so new rough justice. So for the JRS, it was going wide. Probably for the self-employment scheme, it was more concerned about fraud, because it's sort of easier to see how you can defraud a self-employment scheme than it is a job retention scheme. And there it had, there it insisted on you having put in a tax return in order so that it could, as a way of preventing fraud.
Yeah.
But of course, it is worth noting that some of the devolved nations did have schemes applying to the newly self-employed, which were on top of the SACE scheme, and some of those did go to the newly self-employed, but they were a lot less generous. So the scheme in Scotland, which was available to newly self-employed people, which might have included some people in performing arts, only paid £2,000 as a one-off, whereas you could get £7,500 a quarter from the SACE scheme.
Different issue, if I may. The job retention scheme required employers to provide earnings protection provided earnings protection of 80%, subject to an upper limit, but there was no lower limit, which meant that if someone was on minimum wage or thereabouts, the 80% would leave them some significant way below. Yeah. Is that, in your view, a cause for concern, particularly perhaps when viewed through the lens of inequalities?
Yeah, there was certainly a call at the time for the minimum wage to apply even to people who are furloughed, and obviously the people who are on the lowest wages will be those less well equipped to cope with any cut to their earnings. So there is an inequalities case for that. On the other hand, the government would have said that there is always universal credit and the benefit system available to you. And if you were on a minimum wage, then it is quite likely that you would have been able to get some universal credit.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacobs. Ms. Sivakumaran, who's just there.
Dr. Brewer, I ask questions on behalf of the long COVID groups, and I'll be asking you about figures you give in your report about long COVID. Now, you have just given evidence that long COVID could have led to scarring of the economy through a fall in the employment rate or the number of hours worked. In your report to the inquiry, and this is at paragraph 58, I'm not asking it to be called up, you cite your autumn 2021 report, Begin Again, as finding that 600,000 adults were working less or not at all because of the pandemic. But you also say that the majority were referring to mental health issues or fear of catching the virus rather than long COVID. You go on to add that 100,000 people mentioned long COVID explicitly in the survey. Now, we've gone back to that Begin Again report, and it states that the rise in economic inactivity could be linked to long COVID, but there's no reference to numbers of how many people were reporting long COVID. So please, could you help us just to understand these figures? Where did you derive the figure of only 100,000 people mentioning long COVID from?
Right now, I can't remember. I noticed that earlier on in that paragraph, I'm citing the report by Waters and Wernham, which also had an estimate of 110,000 people not working because of long COVID.
Yes, and that was a separate report, so the IFS study.
Yeah.
But in terms of your Begin Again report, you'd listed a number of, you'd cited a survey, well, to assist you, that's the YouGov survey that you'd referred on. But when we look at the Begin Again report, we couldn't actually see any numbers within Begin Again about how many people had actually referred to long COVID. Can you recall from the survey whether anyone was specifically asked about whether they were suffering from long COVID and if that was impacting their productivity?
I'm afraid I can't remember. Well, I understand the point you are making. I can't remember. I can't remember what led us to write this report, but as I say, we wrote it in good faith, and we believed it to be the truth when I wrote it.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much indeed. If you do remember or discover the answers to the questions, very good. Just send them to us by writing or by email. Thank you very much indeed for your help, Dr. Brewer. I know it must be a very busy week for you, so thank you for sparing the time to come today and for all the help you've given us in preparing the report. And don't worry, of course, we will be taking very much into account the full contents of the statement you've provided. So thank you very much indeed. We shall break now and I shall return at 11:25.
All rise.
Ms. Nimmo.
Milady, may I please call Sophie House?
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I should give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Hope we haven't kept you waiting for too long.
No.
Can you please confirm your full name to the inquiry?
Yeah, Sophie Howes.
Thank you, Ms House. You've produced a witness statement for this module with the number INQ 000648237, which you signed on the 26th of June 2025. Can you confirm, please, that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yeah, I can confirm that.
Ms House, you are giving your evidence today in your capacity as Head of Policy at Child Poverty Action Group. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you explain in your statement that Child Poverty Action Group works on behalf of children across the UK growing up in poverty, and which, using research that is carried out with children and families, campaigns for policies to prevent poverty. So I'll ask you first some questions about the profile of child poverty in the UK before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And in light of the terms of reference setting out the inquiry's remit, the focus of my questions will concern what the situation was in relation to child poverty at the time, as opposed to how it had come to be that way. You outline in your statement that while there are different ways to measure poverty, Child Poverty Action Group prefers to look at relative poverty after housing costs on the basis that it more accurately reflects how much money families have left to live on compared to other households. And the Department for Work and Pensions publishes data on child poverty. At the outset of the pandemic, how many children in the UK were living in relative poverty according to those statistics?
So those statistics show that 4.3 million children were living in poverty in 2020. And that it's worth noting that that was a record high at the time for the UK.
Are you saying in your statement that families with children are at greater risk of poverty than the general population?
Yeah.
Why is that the case?
So that's for a few different factors. Families with children obviously have to meet the additional costs of raising those children, but wages don't adjust for family size. And also, at the same time that children kind of are born into a household, often the working capacity of parents is limited because they're caring for children. So they might be working on a more part-time basis, so their actual income is reduced at a time when household costs have increased. And so therefore, that's where the risk of poverty increases.
So to what extent does financial support provided through the social security system play an important role in reducing child poverty levels?
It plays a really, really critical role. So if you look at the incomes of low-income families, they are hugely reliant on support from the social security system to top up wages, often is the case. They are reliant on the support of the social security system to help them meet those additional costs of dependent children. And so when that system is cut back, which is what we saw over the kind of 10-year period preceding the pandemic, they are left in a very vulnerable financial situation.
So you say that low-income families with children are particularly financially vulnerable to economic shocks. Is that the case?
Yeah. So we would say that they would have gone into the pandemic in a particularly precarious position because of their reliance on the social security system and what had happened to the social security system in the previous decade.
Are there certain families for whom economic vulnerability is compounded due to inequalities in the labour market and the social security systems?
Yeah, so there are certain groups of families that are more likely to be living in poverty. So black minority ethnic families are more likely to be living in poverty. And that is often about additional labour market barriers that group may be experiencing, some demographic factors as well, so sort of the number of children in families. Also, children, a higher proportion of children in poverty live in a household where somebody is disabled, so either a disabled child, a disabled parent. So those things will, again, as you could, they limit the kind of labour market participation of that household, and so therefore they're more likely to be vulnerable. There's also kind of demographic compositions that are worth thinking about. So families with very young children, children under 5, are more likely to be living in poverty. Lone parent families are more likely to be living in poverty because there's only one earner in the household. And then larger families, so families with 3 or more children.
Couldn't slow down, could you?
Yeah, sorry.
Right.
You explain in your statement that children who grow up in poverty are less likely to have a well-paid job than their peers. That, of course, has implications for those individual children, but why is that also significant for the wider economy?
So it's really significant for the wider economy. So child poverty has a huge impact on children's outcomes. So there is a substantial amount of research out there to demonstrate that it affects their developmental, their educational, and their health outcomes. And so what that means is that then you are less likely to be healthy in adulthood, you're less likely to be in employment, you're less likely to be in a well-paid job. And so all of those things impact on the kind of wider performance of the economy. So at CPAG, we have conducted research to look at the cost of child poverty to the economy, the sort of public purse. And that research showed in 2020 that child poverty was costing the government around £37 billion a year. So that is in both cost to public services, but also in lost tax revenue from people's earning potential not being realised. So it acts as an economic kind of drag, essentially.
During the pandemic, Child Poverty Action Group carried out various pieces of work on the economic impact of the pandemic on low-income families and children, including publishing reports on poverty in the pandemic, as well as weekly briefings which highlighted gaps in support. And it shared these with the UK government and devolved administrations in order to inform their economic responses. Do you consider that the UK government and devolved administrations took the issues raised by Child Poverty Action Group into account in their economic responses?
I think we sought to share evidence from a very early stage in the pandemic, so based on our kind of survey and interview work with families, but it's also just worth noting that we have, at CPAG, we have a particular expertise in social security law, and we collect case studies from frontline welfare rights advisors on a constant basis. So we were receiving over 100 case studies a month at this particular time. So we really had a good understanding of what was happening on the ground and how some of the particularly changes to the social security system were playing out for families. And we sought to share that evidence in a kind of real time with the government during the pandemic. I think it's fair to say that our engagement with government was not, we didn't have much engagement at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think we could put that in the context of, it was a unprecedented time. But as the pandemic went on, I think there were key policy recommendations that we were making and that were not implemented. And I think if they had been implemented, then the financial situation for low-income families would have not been quite as dire as it actually was in the pandemic.
So I want to ask you now some questions about the economic impact of the pandemic on low-income families and child poverty.
Yeah.
We've mentioned the poverty in the pandemic reports.
Yeah.
What did they show about the extent to which low-income families experienced a deterioration in living standards during the pandemic?
Yeah, so what those reports showed very clearly, and this was, so we published 2 reports, so one in August 2020 and one in December. So this really was from the first few months of the pandemic that we were able to see that families on a low income have had experienced quite sudden income drops, so kind of losses from employment. And then they were also experiencing higher expenditure. So they were spending more on food, on energy, on having children at home and needing to homeschool their children and the resources that were required to do that effectively. But there were other factors too, so things not being able to kind of shop around in terms of purchasing food, closure of charity shops, closures of sort of community support that low-income families are much more likely to be reliant on, so things like libraries or food banks, those types of things.
Some people might think of the pandemic as being a time where people spent more time at home and therefore it was an opportunity to perhaps save money.
Yeah.
Was that the case for families living on low incomes?
No, it wasn't. So I think that's where you see a difference in terms of low-income families versus families who are kind of sort of middle or higher income earners, is that low-income families will spend a much bigger proportion of their income on basic living costs, so covering the basics like kind of housing, utilities, food. And so when those costs go up, those families are particularly vulnerable, and it will impact on them in a different way, in a way that higher income households will be more likely to spend more of their income on leisure pursuits. And so when that was shut down during the pandemic, they were often saving money during that period, where that just wasn't the case for low income families because they weren't spending that money in the first place.
Thank you. So turning now to the extent to which the economic response of the UK government was effective in supporting the financial needs of low-income families and children in poverty. Yeah. Did the UK government introduce any economic support to help families during the pandemic that was specifically directed towards the costs of raising children?
No. Free school meal vouchers would be the thing that was targeted at children that was introduced. But in terms of the kind of big ticket economic interventions that I understand this module is looking at, that wasn't targeted specifically at children and families.
I'll ask you now some questions about the effectiveness of specific economic schemes that were implemented during the pandemic and meeting the financial needs of low-income families and children in poverty. Firstly, the uplift to universal credit and working tax credit. You say that Child Poverty Action Group strongly welcomed the uplift and that without it, the situation for children and families would have been much worse. When the uplift was first announced, what did Child Poverty Action Group understand its purpose to be?
So I think I don't think we were necessarily completely clear on what the government's sort of primary objective or motivation was. We were very, very welcoming of that step. As my witness statement says, the situation for children and families would have been much worse. And I think we were very supportive of the idea of providing financial support through the social security system as a mechanism, as like the main way of getting money out to families with children, alongside other people who were using the benefit system at that time. But I think from the outset, we were really clear that the fact that the uplift didn't adjust for household size and didn't specifically think about the needs of individual households was a problem.
That's a topic we'll come on to shortly. Yeah. Could we please have INQ 000657741 on the screen, page 13, paragraph 38. And this is a statement of Katie Farrington, who was Director for Universal Credit and Employment Policy during the pandemic. And she explains here that the objective of the uplift was to deliver additional financial support to people who were suffering disruption due to short-term loss of employment, and that while the government recognised that families with children often did face particular financial pressures and that people did experience hardship and additional costs during the pandemic, that was not the focus of the uplift. And then she goes on to say that increased costs were not part of the policy design. Were there any consequences for low-income families and children in poverty of the fact that the uplift was not designed to help with increased or extra costs?
Yeah, I think there was real consequences of that. We at CPAG would say that that was a kind of false distinction that was drawn by the government to really prioritise support for those who had been kind of were newly unemployed. I think the first thing to highlight is that many people who are claiming benefits are working, so existing claimants of benefits will have been impacted by the same employment disruption that everyone else was during the pandemic. So lots and lots of people claiming benefits were also losing employment. And then I think from the costs point of view, again, we would say that making sure that financial support is reaching those who are most likely to be experiencing financial hardship needs to be a primary objective. And that just wasn't the case because there was no consideration of those rising costs that families on a low income were experiencing.
If I can just take you to explain that the statement to the inquiry of the former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions sets out that in any future emergency, government may want to consider if their focus at that moment was a substantial change in people's falling incomes or other factors like cost of living spikes, which may impact more those with children. This consideration should guide any future response. And you've touched on it in your previous answer. Do you consider that in any future emergency, it would be beneficial if any uplift to benefits was introduced with the objective not only of helping those who'd lost income, but also to help families who faced additional or increased costs?
Yeah, so we would want support to be tailored to household need. So I think any uplift that was introduced in a future emergency, we would want that to be reflective of how many people are in that household, what the financial costs that household's going to be dealing with. I think it's also just worth highlighting in terms of this the pandemic we've lived through is that uplift was layered upon a system that wasn't providing people with the right amount of support because of things like the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, which meant that actually for families with children, they were already not receiving adequate levels of support to meet their household need, and then they received an uplift that again wasn't reflective of household need.
I don't follow, forgive me, I'm sure it's my fault. You're the expert in this field.
Yeah.
How do you, if you've got the system of universal credit, which I gather has a much better IT system than legacy benefits, but how do you tailor any uplift in universal credit to household, how many in the household? I'm not following how that works as a matter of practicality.
So what we were calling for during the pandemic was that money would have been put into children's benefits specifically. So instead of, we had £20 on the UC standard allowance, which would have been basically meant that a single adult household would have got £20, and then a lone parent with 3 children would have also got £20. Whereas what we were calling for was that we welcomed the increase to the standard allowance, but what we were saying is that there needs to be something that's specific to children. And so that the easiest way to do that through universal credit would be to increase the child element of universal credit. So, so we were calling for £10 on child element. So then, that lone parent family would get £50 instead of £20. So.
Thank you.
Just to pick up on that point, it was a flat rate that was applied across the board to the uplift. But later in 2020, the former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions proposed modifying the policy design of the uplift so that the standard allowance and the child element of universal credit should each be uplifted by £10 per week. Can we take from what you said that you would support that policy design in terms of being able more effectively to support household need and children in poverty?
Yeah, that would have been more effective at tackling child poverty, and I think we would at CPAG have been supportive of that change.
The uplift was not applied to legacy benefits other than working tax credit. Did Child Poverty Action Group have any concerns about that?
We did, definitely. So I think we called throughout the pandemic for the uplift to be applied to people in receipt of legacy benefits. And I think, again, there was a maybe false distinction from government that somehow people on legacy benefits, because they were existing benefit claimants, just hadn't been financially impacted in the same way by the pandemic. And I think the evidence from our organisation and from many, many other organisations showed very quickly that just wasn't the case. So I think there was a very strong argument for legacy benefits to have been uprated alongside universal credit.
You mentioned the benefit cap, and the uplift did not factor into its policy design, the benefit cap. You explain in your statement that there was a substantial jump in the number of families affected by the benefit cap at the start of the pandemic. And Child Poverty Action Group, in fact, published a briefing in June 2021 which concerned that jump. So if we could have INQ 000 608 775, page 2 on the screen, please. And we can see from this figure here that around February 2020, near the outset of the pandemic, that the number of households affected by the benefit cap is around 75,000. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And there's then a jump up to 170,000 households being capped. 170,000 households being capped by July 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that the uplift was implemented in April 2020. To what extent was the increase in households affected by the cap the result of the uplift?
So I think a proportion of that figure would have been as a result of benefits being increased, and therefore people are kind of reaching the threshold of how much you're allowed to receive if you are a benefit capped household. But also what you will see here is that lots and lots of families would have been newly affected by the benefit cap because they've lost employment, and so they're therefore no longer protected, and they've been brought into the scope of the benefit cap. And so I think it's important to highlight that during the pandemic, and this is an issue that we raised time and time again with DWP, when we said that this number is increasing and that they needed to look at suspending the benefit cap during the pandemic, DWP would tell us in that situation that people who were newly unemployed would be protected by the grace period. So the policy works in that you have what's called a 9-month grace period, where if you've just become newly unemployed, the benefit cap won't affect you immediately. But what that fails to recognise is that you have to, in the previous, I think it's the previous 12 months, you have to have earned a certain amount of money in a consistent way to then be eligible for the grace period. So there would be lots of families who would be in insecure employment where their income sort of fluctuates month by month. And so when they lost employment during the pandemic, they wouldn't have had that protection from the grace period. So I think the main point is that within those 200,000 families that were subject to the benefit cap in February 2021, many of them, I would say the majority of those newly capped families, would have been in that situation because they've lost employment from the pandemic, rather than they've received this £20 and that's sort of pushed them above the threshold.
So you mentioned the grace period there. Can we take it from what you said that Child Poverty Action Group did not consider that the grace period provided adequate protection to low-income families receiving the uplift?
Yeah, no, we didn't. We didn't accept that.
Did the cap therefore limit the extent to which families on universal credit actually received the full amount of the uplift?
Yeah, because the way the benefit cap works is it puts a cap on the amount of income you can have from benefits, and so once you go over that, you just won't get that. So you might not receive the £20 at all. You might receive half of it. You might receive a quarter of it. Depends on how close you were to the threshold. But I think it's just also, I probably should have said in the previous answer, is that in that situation where people become newly unemployed and then newly impacted by the benefit cap, they would be experiencing a loss from their income from employment, but then also they'd see their universal credit award come down because they have been newly benefit capped. So they may face like a double whammy of an income loss.
When you explain in your statement that it was difficult during the pandemic for claimants to modify their behaviour in order to prevent the benefit cap applying to them,
Yeah.
why was that the case?
Because the rationale for the benefit cap is that it's supposed to be a work incentive, so it's supposed to sort of broadly apply to out-of-work families. But as I said, you can still be working a low number of hours and be affected by the benefit cap. But the ways to escape the benefit cap are to increase your employment or to move into cheaper housing. Because the reality is that the majority of benefit cap families live in areas with high rental costs. So in London and the South East is an area particularly hard hit by the benefit cap. So those are the two ways to sort of escape the benefit cap. And both of those options just weren't viable for low-income families during the pandemic. Moving house would have required them to ignore public health restrictions. Working for significant periods would have also required them to ignore those restrictions. And then I think, families with children were managing children at home, so their barriers to kind of going out and participating in employment was very high because there was no school or childcare available to them.
If we could have INQ 000608559 on the screen, please. And this is a letter dated the 3rd of January 2021 to Will Quince, the Minister for Welfare Delivery, and it's sent by a number of charities representing children, including the CEO of your organisation. On page 1, we can see that it's explained that the benefit cap prevents many households from benefiting from the uplift and the difficulties involved in avoiding the cap, in particular during the pandemic. The letter then states that during a meeting with Mr Quince in September 2020, he said that the UK government would review the interaction between the uplift and the benefit cap, and the letter seeks an update on this. Did Child Poverty Action Group receive a response in relation to the issues you raised about the benefit cap and the uplift?
We did receive a response. So we received a letter from the Minister for Employment at the time, Mims Davies. But in that letter, she just reiterates the government support that's already being provided to families, and then says that the focus for government is now getting people back to work, and that the benefit cap is a work incentive. So they would be keeping the benefit cap in place. So it was never communicated to us what had happened with that commitment to conduct a review of the benefit cap.
In your view, would the uplift therefore be more effective in providing financial support to low-income families if its policy design had taken account of the benefit cap?
Yes, it would have meant that financial support would have reached low-income families more effectively if the benefit cap wasn't in place.
Thank you. The uplift came to an end in October 2021, and if we could have INQ 000655625, page 21, paragraph 330 on the screen, please. And this is a statement provided by Neil Cooling, who was the senior responsible owner for Universal Credit during the pandemic. And he says, as the uplift was designed to be a temporary measure, no formal impact assessment was conducted ahead of its withdrawal. However, the poverty impacts of the uplift ending had been modelled prior to the decision to extend the uplift. What assessments concerning the impact of the removal of the uplift would Child Poverty Action Group have expected the UK government to carry out to inform its decision to remove the uplift, and when would you have expected them to have been conducted?
I think we were very much in our conversations with DWP and our engagement with ministers encouraging them to really think about what removing the uplift would mean for households on the lowest incomes, and particularly low-income families with children. So I guess we would have wanted them to be taking into account the poverty impact of removing the uplift, which we knew was really high. So we were modelled that ourselves at CPAG and put that to be between 300 and 350,000 children being pushed into poverty if the uplift was removed. But I think also kind of alongside the sort of stark numbers in terms of poverty figures, there was also just a need for DWP to be carrying out analysis of, what was the reality for children and families during this time. And I think what we saw is that they had, faced a double whammy of sudden income losses, rising expenditure, on top of the fact that they'd gone into the pandemic in really precarious financial circumstances. They didn't have savings, they didn't have a cushion. And so just DWP factoring all of that in to decisions around whether or not to extend the uplift, that's what we would have liked to have seen. Your question around kind of timings, I think it's hard to say when was the optimum time for government to be doing that, but I think from CPAG's side, it was very clear to us within about 3 months of the pandemic that was the situation for families. So, the government had quite a lot of time sitting with that information and analysis about what the reality was, and it didn't seem to be being factored into decision making.
So notwithstanding the position of Child Poverty Action Group that the uplift should be made permanent, do you consider that the time at which the uplift came to an end was appropriate?
No, I don't think we did, because we felt that families were still living with the enduring economic impacts of the pandemic. That's reflected in our poverty in the pandemic reports, where you see that families were reporting more of a deterioration of living standards as the pandemic was going on. So but at this particular point, I think family finances were not in a good place. So at a minimum, we would have liked the government to have extended the uplift further than it did.
Now, you say in your statement that the suspension of in-person job centre appointments during the pandemic caused some issues for people who faced challenges with digital literacy, given that new benefit claims were made online and in-person support from charities was unavailable. Do you consider there was adequate support put in place to support that group of people to make new claims for benefits during the pandemic?
Yeah, the DWP introduced a number of what were called easements to universal credit processes during the pandemic, and we welcomed many of them. So some of them were things that we had called for prior to their introduction. Making it easier to make a claim, and then also a sort of relaxation of conditionality. So where you're asking people to come into the job centre at say weekly or fortnightly appointments, putting a suspension on those things. We really welcomed those steps. But yes, I think during the pandemic there were obviously issues in relation to people needing to access welfare rights advice to support them to be able to make a claim, or similarly getting that support from a job centre. That was not as available, and that would have had an impact. There were also consequences further down the track of DWP suspending certain requirements in terms of making universal credit claims. So one of the things was a sort of a light touch approach to identity checks at the beginning of a universal credit claim. But then what the DWP did is retrospectively seek to then verify those claims.
If I could just pause you there, just specifically on the digital exclusion point.
Okay,
if you think
that's fine.
There's more that could have been done.
Yeah, no, I think there definitely could have been more that could have been done to make sure that people could access independent welfare rights advice, and then also support to be making claims, which normally you would be getting that support from a job centre, and job centres were closed.
So turning now to the coronavirus job retention scheme, and Child Poverty Action Group collected evidence on the impact of furlough, which identified a number of issues with that scheme for low-income families, including issues relating to their ability to cover essential costs, the coverage of the scheme and the benefit cap. Could you just expand on those issues which you see arose for low-income families under the furlough scheme?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to say about furlough is that, it was a hugely welcome. We really welcomed it as a measure, and it would have played a big role in preventing poverty. So furlough was targeted more at sort of, or maybe not targeted, but in terms of households that were in receipt of furlough, they were more middle-income households than, say, the Universal Credit Uplift, which was more targeted at low-income households. But it would have played a real role in preventing poverty because in a situation where you didn't have furlough, those families, those middle-income households, would have then experienced a very sharp and sudden income drop if they had then been claiming universal credit, for example, and that probably wouldn't have met their living costs. So it played a role in terms of poverty prevention, and we really welcomed that. I think there were some gaps in coverage in terms of people who could actually access the scheme. Obviously, the decision was with the employer about whether to furlough people, and there was a correlation between people who are in low-paid and insecure work not being furloughed, and so then being kind of reliant on other types of support. And I think we had concerns about that. Because furlough was at 80%, that also would have meant that for families on the lowest incomes, that 80%, that sort of income drop would have been more significant for them than households on a higher income. So yeah, there were a few sort of gaps in coverage, and then also the amounts that people were receiving at the kind of lower end of the income sort of distribution would have been notable.
So we've discussed today a number of different interventions that were put in place. But can I ask you, taken overall, did the package of economic interventions which were put in place provide adequate support to low-income families and children?
So I think the combination of the uplift and furlough did a lot of heavy lifting in terms of protecting families' incomes. However, I think that the fact that the amounts in universal credit were still not adequate because of that history of the wide-scale kind of cuts to the social security system that preceded the pandemic, and policies like the benefit cap and the two-child limit that placed further limitations on support. I think even with the £20, we felt that the children and families' needs were not being reflected in those economic interventions. They were not being considered as entitled to economic support in and of themselves.
Thank you. I just want to ask you now, finally, a few questions about recommendations.
Yeah.
Do you consider that government planning for an economic response in a future emergency should include a policy option of a more targeted intervention through the social security system based on household need?
Yes, I think we would be supportive of the idea that any future intervention needs to reflect household need, but arguably we need to have a social security system that also does that.
Do you consider that a data set which was capable of tracking UK household incomes and living standards would be helpful in a future emergency in enabling the government to target support through the social security system to households based on financial need?
I think potentially it could be. I think we would say that the best way to ensure that those on the lowest incomes and families on the lowest incomes are protected in a pandemic is to make sure that we have a robust social security system in normal times, because that would mean that they're kind of more financially resilient going into a pandemic, and then the system is able to be pulled as an effective policy lever to protect incomes. So I think making sure that that system is effective all the time is the biggest thing that the government could do in terms of improving its economic response to a future pandemic.
Thank you very much, Ms Howes. My lady, those are my questions for Ms Howes, but there are some CP questions for her.
Thank you, Mr. Mo. Mr. Jacobs, who's over that way.
My lady, I think my direct question about the impact of the 80% earnings protection under the retention scheme has been answered, but I wondered if instead I might ask a follow-up question, which is about how it interacts with universal credit.
You may.
I'm grateful. Ms Howes, Dr Brewer this morning quite helpfully pointed to what might be a sort of counter-argument about the impact of the 80% or the drop of 20% in the job retention scheme suffered by those on the lowest incomes, which is that there is also the support network of universal credit. Do you have a reflection on the extent to which universal credit does solve the problem of a 20% drop for those who are reliant on the job retention scheme?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of reiterate my point earlier of kind of any income drops for those families on the lowest incomes are going to be more keenly felt. So that kind of difference between 80% of your salary and 100% of your salary is going to impact in a different way on low-income households. Universal credit is a dynamic benefit, and it does support people in work, so it would play a role. But I think we would argue that the amounts that people receive within universal credit, even with the £20, was just simply not adequate. So even though support was available through universal credit, we would say that just wasn't enough to protect people from poverty and make sure that they can meet their basic living costs.
I'm grateful. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacobs. I think that concludes all the questions we have for you, Ms Howes. Thank you very much indeed for your help. I'm not sure the stenographer's ever going to forgive me for the fact that two of us who speak very quickly, but thank you for the help you've given in providing the statement. And I'm sure colleagues helped you. Thank you to them as well.
Thank you.
My lady, the next witness is Cameron Malik.
Kept you waiting a bit longer, Ms Malik, but I noticed you've been watching events anyway,
Yes,
so
thank you.
If you repeat,
sorry for the delay.
repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Can you please confirm your full name to the inquiry?
Yep, my name's Cameron Malik.
Thank you, Mr Malik. You've produced a witness statement for this module with the number INQ 000652758, which you signed on the 4th of September 2025. Can you confirm, please, that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do. I confirm that.
Mr Malik, you're giving your evidence today in your capacity as Chief Executive Officer of Disability Rights UK. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you explain in your statement that Disability Rights UK is a leading national disabled people's organisation that is an organisation which is majority led, directed, governed and staffed by disabled people. and it provides services to and represents the interests of disabled people in the UK. Is that correct?
That's correct, yep.
It is also a member of the Disabilities Benefits Consortium, which is a coalition of charities which carries out work to ensure that the benefit system meets the needs of disabled people.
That's correct, yep.
So I'm going to ask you now some questions about the economic circumstances of disabled people in the UK prior to the pandemic. And in light of the terms of reference setting out the inquiry's remit, the focus of my questions will concern what those circumstances were, as opposed to how they had come to be that way. You explain in your statement that disabled people generally face additional costs compared to non-disabled people. Why do disabled people incur extra costs, and what do those costs generally relate to?
Sure. So there's a wide range of reasons why we as disabled people experience greater everyday living costs. And as I've said in my statement, at the last kind of review, that figure is around over £1,000 a month, and that's projected to continue to rise. And the kinds of things that affect that are utility costs, so higher heating costs. For example, if because of your health condition you can't regulate your body temperature, it might require you to have the heating on much longer or at much higher temperatures. Specific dietary requirements because of your health conditions, so you may have to buy specific types of food. Equipment, so actually purchasing equipment that can be quite expensive to aid your everyday independent living. Transport costs, so the transport infrastructure in the UK is not universally accessible, and so many disabled people would rely on kind of taxis, minicabs, or private hire vehicles, which often are far more expensive than what non-disabled people would experience.
What impact do those extra costs have on the ability of disabled people to build up savings?
So I think to understand that context of how those additional costs impact, it's also important to remember that you're often starting from a much lower point when compared to an equivalent non-disabled person. So you're often on lower incomes from a starting point, so whether that be through employment, where you're not being paid the same as an equivalent non-disabled person. We've talked about the pay gap, disability pay gap, as well as the rates of disability employment. Disabled people are in employment. So you're always starting from a lower financial position anyway. And then when you have those additional costs that are every month, it does mean that you are unlikely to put away as much in your pension for future kind of protection, but also finding it very difficult to actually just have savings. And that kind of speaks to your resilience to these kind of shocks.
Yeah, so as you say, that can leave disabled people financially vulnerable to economic shocks and any sort of sudden change in their financial circumstances.
That's correct, yep.
In relation to the social security system, you say in your statement that for many disabled people, living on benefits is not a temporary measure pending them finding a job, it is a long-term existence. At the outset of the pandemic, were a number of disabled people therefore reliant on the social security system to meet their essential costs?
Yes, yep.
During the pandemic, Disability Rights UK engaged with disabled people to obtain evidence about their economic experiences and both published and contributed to various reports setting out its findings. You also shared those findings with government decision makers through correspondence, meetings and various forums. Was that with a view to informing the government's economic response?
Yes, we always wanted to kind of support government to enable them to make the best decisions, but decisions that are informed by lived experience of disabled people who we knew very well.
I'm going to ask you now some questions about the economic impact of the pandemic on disabled people. You explain in your statement that in April 2020, the Disabilities Benefits Consortium carried out a survey of disabled people to find out to what extent they had faced increased costs as a result of the pandemic. Could we please have INQ 000508 218 on the screen, please, page 3. And this article concerns the results of that survey. And we can see there that 95% of respondents to the survey said that their costs had increased as a result of the pandemic. And if we scroll down to the following pages, a number of increased or additional costs were identified as being associated with food, utilities, managing health, and travel and transport. Can you tell us a bit more about why those essential costs may have increased specifically for disabled people during the pandemic?
Yeah, so if so just taking food as a starting point, if traditionally you went out and bought food, or you got someone else to come and support you to go to the shops and actually buy the food yourself, you then found yourself in a situation where you weren't able to do that, and you had to rely on online shopping, where often, the kind of the bargains that we might all look for when we go to the supermarket, you can't identify them. You're having to pay delivery charges. So that kind of increases the cost of food. Often, online orders would have minimum level orders, so you have to order a certain amount before they would deliver. You are likely to be at home longer. So if, for example, you're unable to leave the home, you're at home longer, so your utility costs are likely to go up. If the care that you've been receiving isn't being provided because your care team is isolating, you may have to bring in, at short notice, other private care. So that will be higher charges as well. So there's kind of all sorts of reasons why disabled people were disproportionately impacted during this time.
You also refer in your statement to a report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in December 2020. What findings did that report make about the extent to which the finances of disabled people had been disproportionately adversely impacted by the pandemic compared to those of people without a disability?
So that report talks about the use of food banks, the numbers of disabled people who resulted in using food banks, the fact that the number of over half of people living in poverty would be disabled people living in those households. So those additional costs would just exacerbate the kind of poverty levels that disabled people are already experiencing before they entered the pandemic.
In terms of loss of employment during the pandemic, were people with a disability more likely to lose employment or income during the pandemic than people without a disability?
So what the data showed is, yes, disabled people found themselves more likely to be made unemployed by employers letting people go. So that directly impacted on disabled people's income. In terms of furlough, again, I think it's already been said that disabled people didn't have the choice to request it. But again, what the figures showed is that not as many disabled people would be furloughed as non-disabled people.
And to what extent were young disabled people in particular affected by job losses during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think if you're a young person, you're starting off in your career, you may well be at kind of what are called entry-level roles. That were often the ones that were the hardest hit. We've heard that certain industries where those kinds of young people might be employed were the ones that were laying people off the most. So that as well as if you're kind of a young person who's recently left education, looking for your first work, that would then prove impossible, particularly because of the lockdown and how interviews might be happening. Young disabled people often find themselves where they spend a lot of time working for free, kind of volunteering to try and gain experience, which in this situation meant that they weren't able to do that either.
Turning now to the extent to which the economic response of the UK government was effective in meeting the financial needs of disabled people. Was Disability Rights UK consulted sufficiently by the UK government in relation to its economic response?
No, would be the straight kind of answer on that. And I wouldn't regard it as adequate consultation of any sort.
And why do you say that?
Because we, as kind of the evidence bundle shows in my report, that we consistently throughout the 2 years wrote to government, wrote to ministers, raised issues with kind of signing letters that other organisations were writing, tried to engage with ministers. We wouldn't really get what we would call consultation or actual engagement. Often what it was kind of piecemeal conversations, responses to our letters that were largely dismissive of what we'd said, would often not respond to actual points that we were raising. And where we did get to meet, those were kind of unstructured conversations. It was largely about us being told what government was doing rather than working with us to look at their plans.
What benefit do you consider that consultation or more effective consultation with your organisation would have had for the effectiveness of the UK government's economic response?
Well, when you're faced with this huge pandemic shock, in order to design systems that actually work for the most marginalised people in our society, you can't do that unless you've got those very people and those voices and lived experience in the room where those decisions are being made. Because with the best will in the world, unless you live that life, you don't understand how it's structured and what the impact of decisions being made will be at the delivery point. And kind of moving away from just pure consultation to actual engagement is what we've always asked for.
Taken overall, as a package, do you consider that the economic interventions which were put in place during the pandemic provided adequate financial support to people with a disability?
So overall, I would say no. So while we've heard today about the furlough scheme, where it did support certain types of people, certainly when we talk about disabled people, the overall package of support was wholly inadequate.
And I'll come now to ask you about the effectiveness of those specific schemes in meeting the financial needs of disabled people. Firstly, the uplift to universal credit and working tax credit. Did Disability Rights UK welcome the uplift?
So we welcome the uplift of the £20 a week on universal credit. Yes.
With the exception of working tax credit, the uplift was not applied to legacy benefits. Was it the case that at the outset of the pandemic, there were a number of disabled people in receipt of legacy benefits?
Yes, so there was thousands of disabled people who were still on legacy benefits, and there was a plan, a migration of moving disabled people from legacy to universal credit, but that hadn't been completed. And that migration also offered disabled people a migration protection. So if, as you moved, your new assessment on universal credit meant that you were assessed for less amount, you would be offered a period of protection of the level of money that you had on legacy benefits. So the migration process was important for people to wait for.
To what extent do disabled people make up a disproportionate amount of legacy benefit claimants?
I don't know the exact kind of figure of kind of percentage of disabled people who would be on legacy benefits, but all disabled people who, before the introduction of universal credits, would have been on a legacy benefit and were being migrated over several years.
Thank you. On the 27th of March 2020, Disability Rights UK contributed to a letter which the Disability Benefits Consortium wrote to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, calling on legacy benefits to be uplifted, and also for the 5-week waiting period for the first payment of universal credit to be removed. Why did you consider it necessary to ask the UK government to make those changes?
So on the £20 uplift on legacy benefits, as well as that particular letter, we asked for that consistently because, as a phrase that we've heard today is kind of rough justice, to say to people that because of a government's IT system, there is no way that we can support those individuals and that we just have to leave them. Or the answer was to apply for universal credit, and if people did that, they would then not get the migration protection. So there was a disincentive there as well. But also, to use in the middle of a pandemic that temptation to say we can move you to universal credit now, let's transition you now, just feels fundamentally the wrong time to be doing that and using that as the way of moving people to universal credit during a pandemic rather than thinking about the financial impact that they were experiencing right now and applying the £20 on the legacy benefits.
And you just told us that you wrote on a number of occasions to ministers. Another occasion was on the 15th of June 2020, when you wrote to the Minister for Disabled People and asked the Minister to confirm why employment and support allowance had not been increased and whether any monitoring of ESA claimants had taken place to see if they needed the increase. Did you receive a response on those points?
When we do get responses from government departments and the minister, often it doesn't respond to the specific questions that we're asking. And what we tended to get was often reasons why they were unable to do something, rather than kind of addressing specific points that we may ask.
So overall, what impact did the decision not to extend the uplift to legacy benefits have on disabled people?
Well, the things we heard from people who rang our helplines and what we heard from our networks was that it was the difference literally between choosing to eat a meal or choosing to stay warm. It was as stark as that. And with kind of thinking about the fact that, you're already starting from a worse position, you're then left where you're not giving the uplift, but all your other costs are going up. It was literally as stark as that. So, people were choosing to go without food.
Thank you. When the then Chancellor first announced the uplift in March 2020, he explained that the uplift would strengthen the safety net. And when he announced the 6-month extension of the uplift, he stated, "We're also extending our support for the lowest paid and most vulnerable. To support low-income households, the universal credit uplift will continue for a further 6 months." Now, you say in your statement that the Chancellor's messaging about the uplift was inconsistent with its decision not to extend it to legacy benefit claimants. Why do you consider that to be the case?
Sorry, why do I consider
His messaging around the uplift to be inconsistent with the decision not to also uplift legacy benefits?
So if you're talking about protecting the most vulnerable, and then you leave out thousands of people who are on a legacy benefit, then that is a mixed message to say that we are protecting the most vulnerable, but only those who are in receipt of a particular type of benefit and nobody else.
When the uplift was first announced, what did Disability Rights UK understand its purpose to be?
We were told that it was being done for a period of time to support people during the pandemic, to assist with the higher costs. That's our understanding of it.
Could we please have INQ 000655625, page 15 on the screen? And this is a witness statement provided to the inquiry by Neil Cooling, who was the senior responsible owner for Universal Credit during the pandemic. And he explains at paragraph 3.8 that the aim of the government in providing the uplift was to financially assist those who faced significant disruption, particularly those who lost or who were at risk of losing employment or significant earnings and were making a new benefit claim for the first time. And then at paragraph 3.9, Mr. Cooling goes on there to say that the Universal Credit IT system could not differentiate between those who claimed because of the effect of the pandemic and those claiming for other reasons, and so the uplift was applied to every recipient of Universal Credit. And he explains that this meant that the uplift was still not quite as targeted as ministers would have liked, and existing Universal Credit claimants received an unavoidable windfall. Were there disabled people who were existing Universal Credit claimants before the pandemic who nonetheless experienced financial disruption as a result of the pandemic?
Well, yes, absolutely. So, the impact of the pandemic was felt universally by disabled people. And so whether you were on universal credit or legacy benefit, prior, you would have experienced the impact of the pandemic itself.
And you mentioned there that equally applies to those on legacy benefits before the pandemic, is that correct?
Yes.
In your view, would it have been beneficial if the government had introduced an increase in benefits to help not only people who had lost employment or income, but also people who faced additional or increased costs as a result of the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely.
Kickstart. Kickstart was a job creation scheme during the pandemic for young people on universal credit. Did you welcome Kickstart as a potential means of supporting young disabled people to enter employment?
So we absolutely, of course, we welcomed Kickstart when we first heard about it and what it was trying to do. But I think often with these things, it's what the detail tells you about who's actually eligible for it and how it works. So that's where our concerns came. But initially, yes, we absolutely welcomed it.
Come on to those issues now about eligibility. And if we could please have INQ 000592945 on the screen, please. And we can see from page 1 here that this is a submission dated the 19th of February 2021, which was provided to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. And it concerns access to Kickstart for young people on legacy benefits, as well as young people on personal independence payments. And we can see at the bottom of that page there that the recommendation provided is that Kickstart should continue to be limited to people aged between 16 to 24 on universal credit, especially as the link between Kickstart and universal credit is perceived as a potential incentive to encourage legacy claimants to transfer to universal credit. And it goes on to say the option to expand to further groups of claimants with disabilities and health conditions is considered for a potential further phase of Kickstart to run beyond the life of the current scheme. If we could then have INQ 000658355 on the screen, please. And this is a private office note to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, dated the 3rd of March 2021, concerning the submission on expanding Kickstart eligibility. And it explains that the submission on eligibility followed a request from the Minister for Disabled People to look into whether support or opportunities for disabled people could be increased, as he's concerned there is nothing in the plan for jobs package for them. So first, did you have any concerns about the support available for disabled people in the plan for jobs?
Yes, there wasn't a specific plan targeting disabled people with regards to employment.
And if we could just have that note back up on the screen for a second. We can see there that the note goes on to explain that the submission advises against the expansion of eligibility due to policy design challenges, and that there is also the argument that only having eligibility on Kickstart may act as an incentive to move across to universal credit. And on the right-hand side of the document, we can see the Secretary of State's handwritten response. And she says, "I agree it should be seen as an incentive to move to universal credit and keep it as a feature." Do you consider that opening Kickstart up to young people on legacy benefits or personal independence payments would have been beneficial for young disabled people?
Absolutely, because the experience of disabled people and the immense amount of barriers that disabled young people experience in gaining employment, anything that can support young people to get into employment would be positive, and to then restrict it in this way.
And in the circumstances of the pandemic and the job losses that you've told us about, are there any reasons why you think it would have been useful in the context of the pandemic?
Yes. So again, what we know is that kind of entry-level jobs, lower entry-level jobs, lower paid jobs are the ones that are often the most at risk, and often young disabled people are likely to be in more of those entry-level jobs than more kind of senior roles, and therefore having a scheme that you can then access to help you get back into the workplace is really important. And we know that it takes much longer for a disabled person to find employment, and particularly if you've been out of work for a year or so, the chances of getting back into employment kind of accelerate in how long it's going to take you to find employment.
Katie Farrington, who was the Senior Responsible Officer for Kickstart, suggests in her statement to the inquiry that as part of preparing for the economic response to a future emergency, the government should consider whether a disability employment scheme should be introduced alongside a youth employment scheme like Kickstart. Do you think that suggestion has merit?
Yes, I do. And I think what I would add is that it should be designed with disabled people's organisations.
I would like now to ask you about the coronavirus job retention scheme. In his expert report for the inquiry, Dr Mike Brewer has suggested that the UK government should consider whether in any future furlough scheme, employees should have a right to make a formal request to be placed on furlough. We've heard that this morning. In your view, would giving employees such a right assist people with long-term sequelae and other disabled people who might need to shield in a future pandemic?
Yes, I do agree with that, because for several reasons, people with underlying health conditions who choose to isolate or self-isolate, meaning that they weren't able to attend work, being able to request to be put on furlough would be a positive move, yeah.
Digital exclusion. You say in your statement that disabled people are more likely to be digitally excluded than people without a disability. What impact did that exclusion have on the ability of disabled people to participate in the economy, access financial services, and benefit from economic interventions during the pandemic?
So yes, there is a digital divide in the country, and the reasons behind that are economic. So disabled people often don't have the resources to buy and have the latest equipment, technical equipment, laptops, computers, phones, etc., and as well as have access to broadband. So there's a kind of structural issue that exists, starting point. And then during the pandemic, of course, almost everything moved online. So if you're applying for a benefit, or if you're applying for a government scheme, if you're ordering food, it required you to do that online. So there's the point of having not only the equipment, but assistive technology, which can be very expensive. So if you're a blind user, you need screen readers, that can be very expensive. And then in addition to that is just your kind of understanding of how to use technology. We know that for many people who haven't got access to it, when they do get access to it, you need to provide training so people know how to use those systems.
So what, if anything, do you think could be done to ensure that disabled people are not economically disadvantaged as a result of digital exclusion in any future emergency?
So having alternative ways of applying for something, so particularly government services, being able to apply over the phone, particularly, but I think the other thing is around making sure that people are then provided with equipment and training as well, so that we actually address the digital divide before we enter another pandemic.
I will ask you now some questions about the economic impact of long COVID. During the pandemic, Disability Rights UK published a number of articles concerning the impact of long COVID. In that research, did you note an overall rise in the number of disabled people during the pandemic? And were you able to discern to what extent that increase was due to long COVID?
So we started to hear about long COVID and the different ways that manifested itself in people's ability and everyday kind of activity. We heard figures of about 1 million people with long COVID. And you know, the other data that backs that up is access to benefits and the welfare benefit system, and those numbers are going up. So certainly it's been a major factor in the increase in the numbers of disabled people, the million or so with long COVID.
When you were speaking to your organisational networks, were you told anything about the impact that long COVID was having on employment prospects and the finances of individuals?
Well, I mean, part of the issue is with long COVID is about how it's assessed, and an agreement from the medical profession of what constitutes to having long COVID, how the system, the welfare benefit system, kind of considers that, and whether the system is designed to accept the conditions that people are explaining as constituting as a disabled person. So I think there's that. The other thing is a lack of understanding and awareness from employers about what long COVID is, how it's affecting people, and thinking about reasonable adjustments within the workplace. So under the Equality Act, disabled people have a right to request reasonable adjustments within a workplace. And if it's not clear with your employer and yourself with the evidence that you might need, it can often be difficult for people to almost prove that they are affected by long COVID in the way that they're saying.
Finally, Mr Mallock, in your statement you set out observations about what could be done to ensure that the economic response in any future pandemic is effective for disabled people. In particular, you emphasise the need for government to proactively engage with disabled people's organisations and with disabled people to inform plans for any future economic response. And you've already touched on that in your evidence. But could you explain to us why you say that proactive engagement is particularly important?
What we've always called for is a funded, structured framework for ongoing engagement with disabled people's organisations, so that we don't wait until the next emergency or pandemic that happens, but actually government systems and policymakers and legislators are engaging with disabled people and our organisations so that we can design inclusively from the outset, so that when and if the next pandemic happens, systems have been designed with that in mind, with inclusive responses in mind. And also just bringing the lived experience of disabled people into government is essential for good policy making and good legislation.
You also mention in your statement the increasing of support through the social security system. That aside, is there anything further that Disability Rights UK considers could be done better to ensure that the economic response in any future pandemic provides effective financial support for disabled people?
So making sure that financial support is targeted at the very kind of those people who need it in terms of financial resilience, people on the lowest incomes, people who are in the poverty line and below that. So really making sure that targeted support goes to those members of our society, those who've got the least ability, financial resilience through savings and other methods to kind of weather that storm, really. So that kind of targeted response.
Thank you, Mr Mallock. Melody, those are my questions, but there are some CP questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Mallock. Mr Jacobs, who's over that way, Mr Mallock.
Mr Mallock, a question on behalf of the Trades Union Congress, if I may. In relation to the furlough scheme, you've described some of the potential benefits for disabled persons. Your statement also describes that disabled people were more likely to be furloughed, which may indicate underlying prejudice within workplaces, such as a frustrating perception that they would be less able to adapt to new working practices or were generally among the less productive staff members. Are there ways in which, thinking towards the next pandemic, schemes could be more sensitive to protecting disabled persons in these sorts of respects?
I think what's behind some of these things is just a societal belief about who disabled people are, and actually tackling that. And there's a role that government plays in the narrative about us as people and how we contribute, and actually seeing adjustments and support as an investment rather than a cost or a burden. But the idea of allowing disabled people to request to be on furlough would be one way. But also, we've moved to remote working. It's something that we as disabled people have asked pretty much forever. The idea that we want flexible working, the ability to work remotely. I think it's really important that we don't lose what we've now done. And as I've said before, the pandemic showed that because we were able to make that happen because it was impacting on non-disabled people. But when disabled people were asking for it, it wasn't kind of done. Now that we have shown that it can happen, we mustn't kind of roll that back. We need to see that as a positive to enable more disabled people to work. And so in a future situation, another option to furlough would be that you work remotely because we've proved that can be done.
And no doubt that objective can be supported by the government with its guidance and associated documents and what have you.
With that, but also we have schemes like the Access to Work scheme that are specifically designed to support those adjustments and costs beyond what might be seen as reasonable, to making sure that access to work is fit for purpose rather than the danger that it's in currently.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Thank you, Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. That completes the questions we have for you today. I'm afraid I'm not sure you can say goodbye to me just yet, because I know you've given me a lot of help already, and I think there may be a possibility of your returning for Module 10. But thank you so much for all the help you've given me today. I'm really grateful.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
And I shall return at 1:45.
All rise.